The CEO of a construction company was left in shock when he saw a female worker identical to his daughter who had disappeared 20 years ago. What he did next will leave you speechless. The construction site of a large apartment complex on the outskirts of Mexico City was buzzing with activity from the early hours of the morning. Towering cranes cut across the sky, and the hustle of workers filled the place. That day, the president of the construction company, Gustavo Mendoza, personally visited the site. Despite his 62 years, Gustavo walked with a straight back, carefully inspecting every detail at his side. Always like a shadow was his 60-year-old secretary, Luisa Vargas. She had been his loyal assistant for many years, managing everything, from his schedule to personal details. "Mr. President, this way please. I'll show you the area where the framework has been completed," said Luisa, gently taking his arm to guide him. That he nodded, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the site. His decades of experience in the construction industry showed in the way he observed everything. "How's the quality of the materials?" Gustavo asked the foreman. "We only use the best, sir. Would you like to check personally?" They walked past an area where several workers were cutting and welding steel rods. The metallic noise filled the air, but something suddenly caught Gustavo's attention. Among the workers, he saw a young woman with a yellow helmet, overalls covered in dust, and thick gloves. She was lifting 2 bags of cement alongside her colleagues. The young woman paused to wipe the sweat from her forehead, and when she turned, her eyes met Gustavo's. It was as if the world stopped. The face, the smile, even the way her eyes slightly lifted when she smiled reminded him so much of his late wife that his hand trembled. The young woman, unaware of his reaction, returned to her work, carrying heavy beams with surprising strength for her build. Gustavo, however, stood frozen, feeling as if he had just seen a ghost. "Luisa," he whispered, never taking his eyes off the young woman. "Find out that worker's name." Luisa, noticing her boss's unusual expression, nodded and discreetly approached the foreman. While she spoke to him, Gustavo remained still, his attention fixed on the girl who was hammering planks into the framework with firm determination. Each hammer strike echoed in his chest like a reminder of a past he thought was lost. Could it be possible that she's? The thought alone shook him. After finishing the site visit, Gustavo returned to his office. Sitting in his spacious office overlooking the city, he stared out the window, lost in thought. The image of the young worker, with her yellow helmet and that painfully familiar smile, wouldn't leave his mind. That a lump formed in his throat, and he struggled to breathe. A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Luisa entered with a folder in her hand. "Mr. President," she said softly, "I investigated the worker you pointed out." Gustavo looked at her anxiously and grabbed the folder with trembling hands. "Her name is Helen Torres. She is 29 years old. Her childhood name was Helen Sofia. She lived with her mother, but her mother passed away 3 years ago." The name made Gustavo's face go pale. He turned toward a family photo on his desk. His younger self, his wife Eugenia, and little Helen, barely a year old, smiling. "Helen Sofia," Gustavo murmured, his voice trembling. "That was my daughter's name." Luisa nodded silently. Having worked with Gustavo for years, she knew well the pain of his family's disappearance. Gustavo opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo album. As he flipped through the pages, images of little Helen appeared. Tears filled his eyes as he looked at the child smiling at the camera. "My Helen," he whispered, caressing the picture. "Whenever she cried, I would put this butterfly brooch on her, and she would stop instantly." In the photo, Helen was indeed wearing the butterfly brooch with a radiant smile. Gustavo remembered how he had given it to her on her 5th birthday, and how she treasured it so much she even slept with it on. "Mr. President," Luisa said cautiously, "we should investigate further to confirm if Helen Torres is really your daughter." "I agree," Gustavo interrupted, "but also find out more about her mother." Luisa nodded and left. Gustavo returned to the window, lost in thought. The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual. He had not slept all night, thinking of Helen Torres. When Luisa entered after knocking, Gustavo quickly closed the album. "Luisa, search again for any trace of Eugenia. I gave up 5 years ago, but now I want to try again. And check if that worker's mother has any connection to Eugenia." "Understood, sir." Luisa replied. After she left, Gustavo opened the album once more. Memories of Eugenia flooded back. The joy of meeting her, the happiness of their wedding, and the immense love when Helen Sophia was born. Everything had been perfect until it all changed. Gustavo had thrown himself into expanding his business, neglecting his family. His own mother had been harsh with Eugenia, especially for having a daughter, and he did nothing to stop it, hiding behind his work, thinking time would fix everything. One day, when he returned home, Eugenia and Helen Sophia were gone, leaving only a short letter. I can't take this anymore. Don't look for me or for Helen Sophia. Gustavo searched the whole country but never found them. That afternoon, Luisa returned with a serious expression. Mr. President, I investigated Eugenia. She passed away 3 years ago from lung cancer. It seems Helen Torres's mother was. Indeed, Mrs. Eugenia. Gustavo's face crumbled. The world seemed to collapse around him. He had held on to the hope of seeing her again, but now that hope vanished. Helen was with her in her final moments. It seems she truly is your daughter. Helen Sophia, Luisa added. Overwhelmed, Gustavo collapsed onto his desk in tears. The thought of how hard life must have been for Eugenia, alone with Helen, and his own failure as a husband and father, tore him apart. After a long time, he lifted his head, his eyes red. Luisa, find out more. I want to know how Helen remembers me, what Eugenia told her about me. I want to know everything. Understood, sir, Luisa replied. Gustavo walked to the window, gazing at the sky. Although Eugenia was gone, Helen Sophia was still alive. He wanted to be a true father to her, even after so many years. Eugenia, he whispered toward the heavens. I came too late, but I found Helen Sophia. I will protect her and give her everything I couldn't give you. I promise. 2 days later, Gustavo returned to the construction site. Despite the thoughts tormenting him, he inspected the place as usual. His steps, however, led him to the workers' cafeteria. The place was quiet, with only a few workers eating. Gustavo sat in a corner, watching. Then he saw Helen sitting at one of the tables. Her neat appearance and innocent air reminded him of little Helen Sophia. Suddenly, his eyes focused on something, a worn butterfly brooch in her hair. It was the same brooch he had given her on her 5th birthday. His heart pounded. Helen, Gustavo called. She turned with a surprised expression. Yes, Mr. President, how can I help you? Does that brooch have any special meaning? He asked. Carefully, Helen touched the brooch unconsciously, smiling faintly. I've had this since I was a little girl. It's very special to me. I always wear it. Gustavo's eyes filled with tears as he held back his emotions. It's a very beautiful brooch. Helen smiled brightly. My mother said my father gave it to me, but he's no longer with us. Gustavo's heart shattered. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring back bad memories, Helen said shyly. Gustavo shook his head. No, it's all right, but may I ask you? Before he could finish, one of her colleagues called Helen from the kitchen. She excused herself and returned to work. Luisa approached Gustavo. Mr. President, is it really her? Gustavo took a deep breath. There's no doubt. That brooch is the one I gave her when she was a child. It's unique, with a tiny butterfly-shaped jewel. She asked cautiously, what will you do now? Gustavo thought for a moment. It's not the right time yet. If I suddenly appear saying I'm her father, she'll be confused. I need to know what Eugenia told her about me. Luisa nodded. Understood, Mr. President. Before leaving the cafeteria, Gustavo looked at Helen one last time. She was talking with her colleagues, smiling radiantly. It was the exact same smile she had as a child, his heart filled with warmth. Though Eugenia was no longer there, her greatest gift remained, healthy and bright. He wanted to take responsibility as a father. I bought that brooch for her, Gustavo murmured. Luisa looked at him with sadness. In the car, Gustavo gazed out the window, lost in memories. His daughter's first steps, her first birthday. The moment he gave her the brooch, it all felt like yesterday. Luisa broke the silence. Mr. President, you cannot change the past, but you can change the future. Gustavo nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes. He wanted to tell Helen the truth and regain the lost years, but first, he needed to understand how she saw him and why Eugenia had spoken of him in that way. Tomorrow I'll return to the project, Gustavo decided. Luisa smiled and nodded. His heart was full of both sadness and hope. He wanted to be a real father. To Helen Sophia. It was the last promise he could make to Eugenia and a gift of forgiveness to himself. The next day, Gustavo contacted Helen Torres through Luisa, inviting her to his office. At first, Helen was reluctant. She didn't understand why the president of such a large company wanted to see her, a simple worker. But Luisa insisted. Mr. Mendoza wants to see you personally. It's something important. Finally, Helen agreed that in the afternoon. Helen stood nervously at the office door. She knocked softly. Come in. Gustavo's voice was heard. Helen entered cautiously. Gustavo, standing by the window, turned to greet her. Welcome. Please sit, he said, pointing to a sofa. Helen greeted him and sat down. You asked to see me, sir. Did I do something wrong? Gustavo looked at her in silence for a moment, filled with nostalgia, sadness, and joy. That brooch I saw you wearing yesterday in the cafeteria, it's very special. Yes, it's the most valuable thing I have. Gustavo asked carefully, did you have a childhood nickname? Helen, confused, replied, Crybaby. My mother used to call me that because I cried a lot as a child. Tears welled up in Gustavo's eyes. Containing his emotions, he nodded. That nickname was mine. I gave it to you. Helen looked at him in shock. When you cried, I would pin that brooch on you and you would stop, Gustavo added. Helen's face went pale. She stood up. What are you talking about? Helen, listen to me. Your mother. My mother said you abandoned us. You never looked for us. Helen interrupted, shouting. Gustavo, stunned, stood up. What? I searched all over the country for years. I hired private detectives, but tears filled Helen's eyes. My mother always said you abandoned us, that we didn't matter to you, that you never came for us. She raised me alone, suffering. And now you say you're my father? Gustavo could not answer. He didn't understand why Eugenia had told Sophia such things. He had done everything possible to find them. Sophia, please, he tried again. My name is Helen Torres, she said firmly. I don't want to hear more. Helen rushed out of the office. Gustavo didn't stop her. He just stood there with a look of defeat. Luisa entered cautiously. Mr. President, why would Eugenia say that? Why would she tell young Sophia that you abandoned them? In a hollow voice, Gustavo replied, I don't know. I loved her so much. Luisa stayed silent for a moment. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Or maybe Eugenia wanted to justify her decision. Gustavo turned back to the window, shoulders slumped. What do I do now? Sophia doesn't want me. She believes I abandoned them. Tell her the truth, sir, Luisa said sincerely. Show her how much you tried to find them. Gustavo nodded. But first I want to know how Sophia grew up, why Eugenia said those things, and who helped them. Meanwhile, Helen left the company, walking through the streets with her mind in chaos and her heart racing. Gustavo's words echoed in her head. I am your father. Her mother had always told her that her father abandoned them, that he never cared, never searched for them. But now this man was claiming the opposite. Sitting on a bench, Helen took a deep breath. She decided to visit her grandmother, Dolores, the woman her mother had trusted most. Dolores had always supported them during difficult times. After a long bus ride, Helen arrived at Dolores's small apartment. She knocked on the door and heard her grandmother's warm voice. Who is it? Grandma. It's me, Helen. Dolores opened the door in surprise. Helen, what are you doing here? It's not your day off. Helen forced a smile and entered. Grandma, I need to know what really happened between my mother and my father. Dolores's face grew serious. She looked at Helen in silence for a moment. Why are you asking this now? Today, the owner of the company I work for said he's my father. Helen replied with a trembling voice that Dolores's eyes widened. She sighed and sat down in a wooden chair. I knew this day would come. Is it true, Grandma? Is he my father? Dolores nodded. Yes, Gustavo Mendoza is your father. Tears filled Helen's eyes. Then why did my mother say he abandoned us? He says he looked for us. Dolores began to explain. Your mother didn't want you to grow up in that family. Your paternal grandmother was very harsh with her, especially after you were born. Your father was so focused on his business that he didn't realize how much your mother was suffering. Your grandmother mistreated her, and Eugenia feared you would suffer the same. That's why she left with you. But why did she say my father never looked for us? Helen asked. Dolores sighed. Eugenia knew Gustavo would search, so she hid as well. At first, she fled to protect you. With time, she knew he was searching, but she couldn't go back anymore. Maybe she feared your grandmother more than your father. Helen was shocked. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. If I had known this, I wouldn't have hated him so much, she murmured. Dolores took her hand warmly. Your mother regretted it at the end too. She didn't know how to tell you. Tears streamed down Helen's face. She understood her mother's decision, but the years of hate and misunderstanding still hurt deeply. What should I do now, Grandma? Listen to your heart, Dolores said gently. Gustavo is still searching for you. Give him a chance. Helen stayed silent, reflecting on her grandmother's words. 2 days later, Gustavo was still tormented by his encounter with Helen. As he stared out of his office window, a knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he said. Luisa entered. Mr. Mendoza, Helen Torres is here. Gustavo's eyes lit up. Let her in. Helen entered cautiously, her expression softer but still tense. She sat on the sofa after Gustavo gestured. I went to see my grandmother, Dolores, Helen began. She told me everything. Gustavo stood up, pulled out an old folder from his drawer, and turned on his computer. These are the records of the last 20 years. All I did to find you. On the screen appeared contracts with private detectives, missing persons flyers, investigation reports. I never forgot you, Gustavo said, his voice breaking. Helen looked at the documents, moved by the proof of his effort. I was the one who failed, Gustavo continued. I didn't see how much your mother was suffering. I let my mother mistreat her. I was obsessed with work. Helen picked up the documents with tears in her eyes. The records showed that Gustavo had searched for them since she was 6 years old until recently. My mother, Gustavo went on, wanted to see you before she died. She left a message of apology for Eugenia. Helen's tears fell. Then why did my mother say those things? Gustavo sighed. Maybe she wanted to protect you. Maybe she hated me too much. Helen nodded, remembering her grandmother's words. Gustavo pulled out a small box. These are things I kept from you and your mother. Inside were a doll, a drawing book, and photos. Helen touched them carefully, feeling fragments of her childhood return. I'm still confused. My mother always said you abandoned us, but now, I know, Gustavo said softly. I won't pressure you, but if you give me the chance, I want to be part of your life. Helen thought for a moment. We can take it slow. With tears in his eyes, Gustavo nodded. Take all the time you need. The silence between them was no longer cold, but filled with cautious hope. A week later, Helen called Gustavo for the first time. She had thought deeply about her mother, her father, and her own feelings. Finally, she decided to give him a chance. Hello? Helen, how are you? Gustavo answered on the other end. Can we meet? They arranged to meet at a restaurant. Gustavo was already there when Helen arrived. He stood as soon as he saw her. Thank you for coming, he said sincerely. Helen greeted him shyly and sat down. After an awkward silence, Gustavo spoke. I brought an old album. I thought you'd like to see it. He placed a family album on the table. Helen opened it curiously. The first photo showed a young Gustavo and Eugenia on their wedding day, smiling radiantly. Mom was so beautiful, Helen said, eyes full of tears. Gustavo nodded. She always was, especially when she smiled. Helen flipped through the pages, seeing pictures of herself as a newborn and growing up. In one, when she was 5, she was crying. Gustavo pointed at it. That day, I pinned the butterfly brooch on you for kindergarten. You promised you wouldn't cry if you wore it. Helen unconsciously touched her brooch. I think I faintly remember that, she said with tears. They looked at each other, eyes full of emotions, pain, nostalgia, and hope. Mom was very sick at the end, Helen whispered. But she always thought of me. Before she died, she told me not to hate my father so much. I didn't understand then, but now I do. Gustavo wept. You don't know how much I miss Eugenia? They continued looking through the album, sharing stories. Gustavo spoke of the moments he had with his little daughter, and Helen of the moments with her mother. As they left the restaurant, Helen gathered courage. Can I call you Dad from now on? Gustavo froze, tears streaming down his face. Of course, he said, gently holding her hand. Helen smiled through her tears. Though she still loved her mother deeply, now there was space in her heart for her father. Perhaps that was what Eugenia had wanted all along. They walked together under the evening breeze. Gustavo suggested, what if this weekend we visit Eugenia's grave? You've never been. Helen nodded. Yes, Dad. The word Dad filled Gustavo's heart with warmth. He touched Helen's butterfly brooch, the object that had reunited them. Maybe it carried a message of forgiveness and reconciliation from Eugenia. Father and daughter walked slowly, speaking of the future. Their family story had begun late, but there was still much time ahead. Family can sometimes bring pain, but it can also bring warmth. The story of Gustavo and Helen began with misunderstanding and sorrow, but ended with forgiveness and reconciliation. And somewhere in heaven, Eugenia was probably smiling.